The First Sino-Japanese War, Part 1, East Asia from 1871 to 1893. The First Sino-Japanese War from 25th July 1894 to 17th April 1895, also known as the Sino-Japanese War, was a conflict between the Qing dynasty of China and the Empire of Japan, mostly over influence in Joseon, Korea. After more than 6 months of unbroken successes by Japanese land and naval forces and the loss of the port of Weihaiwei, the Qing government sued for peace in February 1895. The war showed the failure of the Qing dynasty's attempts to modernize its military and fend off threats to its sovereignty, especially when compared to Japan's much more successful Meiji Restoration. For the first time, regional dominance in East Asia shifted from China to Japan. The prestige of the Qing dynasty, as well as classical tradition in China, suffered a major blow. The humiliating loss of Korea as a tributary state started a great public outcry in China. Within China, the defeat was a catalyst for a series of political upheavals led by Sun Yat-sen and Kang Youwei, which resulted in the 1911 Qinghai Revolution. After 2 centuries, the Japanese policy of seclusion under the Tokugawa shogunate ended. The country was first opened up to international trade by American Commodore Matthew Perry and the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854. The treaty led to civil unrest and eventually the Boshin Wars and Meiji Restoration. The new government, although first being against all Western influence, had, during the war, reversed that decision and instead followed a massive effort towards modernization. Japanese students were sent to various parts of the Western world, particularly the USA, Britain, and France, to learn about military, government, and industrial technology. They were then tasked to return and teach what they learned to Japanese schools. The goal was to quickly change Japan from a feudal state to a modern one. They were quite successful. The Qing dynasty tried to do the same thing for China, but was far less successful. In January 1864, the King of Korea, Chojong Joseon, died without an heir. By blood connection, Gojong of Korea was named king, but he was only 12 years old. Therefore, his father became Hengshon Daiwongun. That is similar to regent, or lord of the great court. The regent then made some changes to strengthen the monarchy, at the expense of the other members of the ruling Yangban class. He also pushed for an isolationist policy, wanting foreign influence out of the country, especially ideas. In Korean history, the king's in-laws had a lot of power. Because of this, the regent thought that any future daughters-in-law might threaten his authority. Therefore, he tried to prevent this possible threat to his rule by selecting as a new queen for his son an orphaned girl from among the Min clan, which didn't have any powerful connections. With this new Empress Myeongjeong as his daughter-in-law and the royal consort, the regent felt secure in his power. The problem was that she had ideas of her own. After she became queen, Min, as she is usually called, recruited all her relatives and had them appointed to influential positions in the name of the king. The queen also allied herself with the regent's political enemies. By late 1873, she had enough influence to remove him from power. When it was said that the young king was old enough to rule for himself, she took the opportunity to force the regent to retire. This also brought about the end of the Korean isolationist policy. On February 26, 1876, troubles with Japan resulted in the Ganghwa Treaty, opening Korea to Japanese trade. In 1880, the king sent a mission to Japan to observe the modernization process there. While the Korean diplomat was in Japan, a Chinese diplomat gave him a document called the Chaoshan Selu, which is a strategy for Korea. It was a warning about the threat to Korea by the Russians and recommended friendly relations with Japan. At this time, Japan was too economically weak to be a threat. It also said for Korea to work closely with China and make an alliance with the United States to be a balance against Russia. After returning to Korea, the diplomat gave the document to King Gojong. He thought that it was great and had copies made of it to give to his officials. In 1880, King Gojong decided to make diplomatic relations with the United States, with Chinese help. In Tianjin, the Treaty of Peace, Amity, Commerce, and Navigation was formally signed between the U.S. and Korea in Incheon in 1882. There were big problems in this treaty. They were about Korea's status as an independent nation. The Chinese insisted that the treaty had an article that declared Korea is a tributary of China. The U.S. totally opposed that. A compromise was made with the King of Korea would send a letter claiming the status as tributary of China. This deal looked so good that it became a model for deals between Korea and all other treaties with Western countries. The king then signed similar treaties with Great Britain and Germany in 1883, Italy and Russia in 1884, and France in 1886. Other European trade treaties were made after this as well. Other events were happening. In 1871, a fishing boat from Okinawa shipwrecked on the coast of Taiwan. 54 Okinawan sailors were murdered by the local Taiwanese tribesmen. This was called the Mudan Incident. The Japanese government demanded reparations and justice from the Chinese government for the incident. The Chinese refused, as they had just recently had a rebellion there and had just finished with it. They said that they had very little control over the Palawan Taiwanese at the southwestern tip of Taiwan. The Japanese government decided to sort out the problem themselves. This resulted in the Japanese invasion of Taiwan in 1874. A few skirmishes and one battle occurred. The local tribe was defeated and the chief killed. This was the first overseas deployment of the Japanese Army and Navy. Even though it was a very small force, it encouraged the Japanese government to do more of this. In 1874, The British government intermediated, and an agreement was signed, with China paying the Japanese government compensation. Then the Japanese force withdrew. This led to a stronger feeling of confidence and the eventual complete annexation of Okinawa, mediated by President Grant of the United States in 1879. Japan then became more interested in Korea and Taiwan. After 1879, changes happened with China as well. A new foreign minister, Li Hongzhang, was appointed. He became important with his role as general in suppressing the long Taiping Rebellion a few years beforehand, which was a decades-long rebellion. Before the Japanese involvement in Taiwan, he wanted a stronger military and was made governor of one of the Chinese provinces, Zili, and commissioner for the northern ports. He was in charge of China's Korea policy and urged Korea to do the same to make it strong enough to deal with foreign threats. King Gojong liked the idea. The Korean government then started a doctrine of Eastern ways and Western machines, Tongdo Sogi. They wanted to selectively accept and master Western technology while preserving the country's cultural values and heritage. In 1881, an administrative reforms office was formed, modeled on the Chinese structures. 12 different agencies were created, and a technical mission was sent to Japan to survey their industrial facilities. A group was also sent to Tianjin, China, to study weapons manufacturing. Here they are there. Chinese technicians were invited to Seoul as well. The Koreans then invited the Japanese military attaché, a lieutenant, to serve as an advisor in creating a modern army. A new military formation called the Pyeolgigung, or Special Skills Force, was established. 80 to 100 young men of the aristocracy were to be given Japanese military training. The next year, in 1882, the government also reorganized the 5 army garrison structure into the Palace Guards Garrison and the Capital Guards Garrison. During the 1880s, the Japanese government became focused on Korean reform as a matter of national security. As it was thought, Korea was a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. It was not only because it was near Japan, but also from its inability to defend itself. If Korea was really independent, then it would be no threat. But it was still considered backward and easy for other nations to attack and take over. The Japanese belief was that the Korean independence needed the Koreans to do as Japan did and rapidly modernize and gain Western civilization. The Japanese were not really being altruistic, because if Korea could resist other nations, like China and Russia, then the Japanese could then have more influence there. The Japanese government were more concerned, not so much as reforming Korea, but how it was reformed. They had 2 ways of doing this. One was to be passive and just bring reformist ideas to Korea and help when asked. And the other was to be more aggressive, interfering with Korean politics to make sure that their kind of reform happened. the Japanese government swung between these two positions. Japan at this time was still weak following the Boshin Wars and the Peasant and Samurai rebellions in the 1860s and 1870s. It had financial problems with inflation due to the expenses from those wars. The Japanese government therefore usually chose the passive policy towards Korea. They also sent the small military mission led by Horimoto Reizo to train the Pyogigun. What was more worrying to the Japanese was that China had loosened its tributary state control over Korea through Japanese efforts, but the Chinese were actually trying to take control over the country again. The Imo Incident. In 1882, there was a severe drought in Korea, which created a shortage of food there. Korea was nearly bankrupt and was falling behind in military pay, which of course angered the soldiers. The regular Korean army also resented the Pyogigun because they were better equipped and treated. Also, more than 1,000 soldiers were discharged with the reorganization of the army. They were mostly old or disabled, and the rest of the army had not been paid in rice for 13 months. In June, King Gojong was told of this, and he ordered that 1 month's pay in rice be immediately given to the soldiers. He ordered Min Gyom-ho, the overseer of government finances, and the queen's nephew, to handle the matter. Min then handed the problem to his steward. The steward then sold the good rice that he had been given and used some of the money to buy millet mixed with sand and bran. The rice became rotten and inedible. This fake rice payment infuriated the soldiers. On July 23rd, a military mutiny and riot broke out in Seoul. Angry soldiers went for Min's residence, as they thought that he swindled them. Min ordered the police to arrest the ringleaders and have them executed the next morning. He thought this would calm down the other angry soldiers. That didn't work, though. The rioting soldiers broke into Min's house to get revenge. Min wasn't at home, so they just destroyed his furniture and possessions. The rioters then went to an armory and stole weapons and ammunition and headed for the prison. They took out the guards and released the men taken the day before, as well as all other political prisoners. Min then sent the army to put down the rebellion, but it was already too late. The original rebels were joined by a huge number of the poor and angry citizens. The mutiny was now a major rebellion. The rioters then turned their attention to the Japanese. One group headed for the Japanese lieutenant's quarters, while another group, about 3,000 rebels, headed for the Japanese legation, where the Japanese diplomats were. The mob surrounded the legation and wanted to kill everyone inside. The Japanese foreign minister ordered that the legation be burned as well as all documents. The members of the legation then escaped through a rear gate, hurried to the harbor, and boarded a boat which got them out of there to the city of Chimopo. They were protected by the Incheon commandant, but had to flee again when their escape was discovered, and then the attitude of their hosts changed. They escaped to the harbor in heavy rain, chased by Korean soldiers. 6 Japanese were killed, 5 were wounded. The survivors escaped on a small boat to the open sea and were rescued by a British survey ship, the HMS Flying Fish. They were then taken to Nagasaki. The next day after the attack on the Japanese legation, the rioters forced their way into the royal palace, found Ming, and killed him, as well as any other high-ranking officers that they could find. This isn't Ming, this is his brother-in-law, the king. They also looked for Queen Ming, but she escaped, dressed as an ordinary lady of the court, carried on the back of a loyal guard, who claimed that she was his sister. The regent used this incident to try to come back to power. The Chinese then deployed 4,500 troops to Korea. They regained control and crushed the rebellion. In response, the Japanese sent 4 warships and a battalion of troops to Seoul to safeguard Japanese interests and demand reparations. The tensions calmed down, however, with the Treaty of Chimopo on August 30th, 1882. The agreement included that the Korean conspirators be punished and 50,000 yen be paid to each of the families of the Japanese who were killed. The Japanese government would also be paid 500,000 yen, a formal apology, and permission to station troops at the Japanese legation in Seoul. After the rebellion, the regent was accused of starting it, so he was arrested by the Chinese and taken to Tianjin. He was then taken to a one-room private jail near Beijing, where he spent the next 3 years. The reassertion of Chinese influence. After the Imo incident, the reform efforts in Korea suffered a big setback. The Chinese reasserted their influence over Korea and directly began to interfere with Korean international affairs and internal affairs. The Chinese stationed troops at strategic points around Seoul. Then they started tampering with the government. 2 special advisors on foreign affairs representing Chinese interests were sent to Korea. One was a German, Paul Georg von Mollendorf, who was a close friend of Li Hongjiang, the Chinese fellow who controlled the port and the northeast of China following the Taiping Rebellion, and a Chinese diplomat. Oh, there he is, Li Hongjiang. A staff of Chinese officers also took over the training of the army, providing the Koreans with 1,000 rifles, 2 cannons, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. They also created a new Korean military formation, the Chingun-yong, or Capital Guards Command, which was trained in the Chinese way. In October, China and Korea signed a treaty saying that Korea was a dependency of China and granted Chinese merchants to do business freely in Korea. It also gave Chinese extraterritoriality, which meant that they had special privileges in civil and criminal cases. Other foreigners and Japanese didn't have that. Soon, the number of Chinese merchants in Korea greatly increased, which was very bad for Korean merchants. Koreans could trade in Beijing, but at a disadvantage, as they were considered just vassals. The Chinese also supervised the creation of a Korean Maritime Customs Service, headed by Mollendorf. Korea was reduced to a semi-colonial tributary state of China. King Gojong could not appoint diplomats without Chinese approval, and more Chinese troops were stationed in the country to protect Chinese interests. Factional rivalry and the ascendancy of the Ming clan. During the 1880s, two rival groups emerged in Korea. One was a small group of reformers that were called the Gaihwadang, or the Enlightenment Party. They were frustrated by the limited and slow pace of reforms. They were young, well-educated Koreans, and were mostly from the Yangban upper class. They were impressed by the developments of Meiji Japan and wanted to do the same for Korea. All other leaders had spent some time in Japan. This guy, Pak Young-hyo, related to the royal family, had been on the mission to Japan to apologize for the Imo Incident in 1882. He was influenced by Japanese modernizers. The leader was Kim Ok-gyun, who also made the trip and made friends with Japanese officials in Korea as well. They were extremely nationalist and wanted to make the country truly independent by ending Chinese interference in Korea's internal affairs. The other group was the conservatives, which included the Min family and prominent Korean political figures. They wanted to maintain power, but with China's help. They were called the Sadsedang. They wanted gradual change on the Chinese model. After the Imo incident, they were very pro-Chinese. They appreciated the Chinese help through the arrest of the regent and the expansion of Chinese influence in Korea. Many Koreans had similar feelings of being more comfortable with the traditional relationship with China. Because of this, the Min family became advocates of the Western knowledge, Eastern values policy that had begun with moderate Chinese reformers who felt that their perceived cultural values of the China-centered world was best, while acquiring Western technology, especially military technology. Therefore, they did not want to bring in new values, such as legal equality or moderate education like Meiji Japan. They wanted to strengthen the state while preserving the basic social, political, and cultural order. When Queen Min came to power, this group gained total control, frustrating the Enlightenment Party. The Gapsin coup. In the 2 years after the Imo incident, the members of the Enlightenment Party did not get any important government posts. So, they were not able to carry out their reform plans. Because of this, they decided to seize power. In 1884, an opportunity for a coup d'etat happened. In August, China and France went to war over Annam, which was the name then for Vietnam. Half of the Chinese troops were withdrawn. On December 4th, 1884, with the help of the Japanese minister Takazue Shinichiro, who promised to have the Japanese legation guards assist them, the reformers staged a coup. They did it through a banquet to celebrate the opening of the new national post office. King Gojong was expected to attend, together with other high-ranking officials. Many of these were from the Sadagong faction. Kim Ok-gyun and his friends came up to King Gojong with a fake story about Chinese troops making a disturbance and escorted him to the small palace. There, they placed him in the custody of Japanese legation guards. Then, they killed or wounded several Sadagang faction ministers. After the coup, the Enlightenment Party formed a new government and made a plan for reforms. The 14-point plan included these points. Number 1, an end to Korea's tributary status with China. Number 2, the abolition of ruling class privilege and the establishment of equal rights for all. Number 3, the reorganization of the government as a constitutional monarchy. Number 4, the revision of tax laws. Number 5, cancellation of the grain loan system. Number 6, the unification of all financial administrations under one minister. Number 7, the suppression of privileged merchants and development of free commerce and trade. Number 8, the creation of a modern police system, including patrols and royal guards. Number 9, severe punishment of corrupt officials. The other 5 points were apparently minor. The new government lasted no longer than a few days. The reformers were supported by only 140 Japanese troops, who faced 1,500 Chinese troops in the Seoul garrison under the command of General Yuan Shikai. The reform measures were a threat to Queen Min's power, so she requested help from the Chinese. Within 3 days, even before the reform measures became public, the coup was crushed, and Chinese troops attacked and defeated the Japanese forces and restored power to the Seredang faction. In the fighting, the postal minister, who was also an Enlightenment Party member, was killed. The Japanese legation building was burned down again, and 40 Japanese were killed. The surviving coup leaders escaped, including Kim Ok-kyun. They were under escort of the Japanese minister Takuzoe. From the port of Chimopo, they escaped for exile in Japan. In January 1885, Japan decided to make a show of force and sent 2 battalions and 7 warships to Korea. This resulted in the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1885. The treaty restored diplomatic relations between Japan and Korea. The Koreans also agreed to pay the Japanese 100,000 yen, which is quite a bit of money then, for damages to their legation, and provide a new site for the building of a new legation. Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi of Japan then visited China to meet with the Chinese Prime Minister, there he is again, Li Hongzhang, to discuss the coup. They succeeded with the Treaty of Tianjin on May 31st, 1885. Both sides agreed to withdraw their troops from Korea within 4 months and would make prior notification to the other if troops were to be sent to Korea in the future. After both countries withdrew their forces, they left behind a precarious balance of power in Korea. The Chinese General Yuan Shikai still remained in Seoul as the senior Chinese resident and continued to interfere with domestic politics. The failure of the coup marked a dramatic decline in Japanese influence in Korea. The Nagasaki Incident. The Nagasaki Incident was a riot that took place in Nagasaki in 1886. 4 warships from the Qing Empire's navy, the Beiyang Fleet, stopped at Nagasaki. They were there for repairs. Some Chinese sailors caused trouble in the city and started a riot. Some Japanese confronting the rioters were killed. They were policemen. The Qing government did not apologize for the incident, which resulted in a wave of anti-Chinese sentiment in Japan. The bean controversy. A poor harvest in 1889 led the governor of Korea's Hamgyong province to stop soybean exports to Japan. Japan requested and received compensation in 1893 for their importers. This incident showed a growing dependence for Japan on Korean food imports.